The weapon leaves the tube and control disappears instantly, not slowly, not quietly, but in a way that feels wrong the moment it happens, because what was meant to end the threat hesitates, turns, and begins to come back. This was supposed to be the safest moment, the moment when training mattered, when trust in steel and orders finally paid off. Yet the ocean suddenly feels like a closed room, and the danger is no longer out there but inside it. Every man on board believed in this launch, believed in the silence that should have followed, believed that once released the weapon would never look back, but now there is no alarm that explains it and no command that fixes it. Only the growing realization that something fundamental has broken. The confidence they carried into this moment drains away, replaced by the terrifying sense that the Navy's promise has cracked at the worst possible time. And somewhere far from this steel hull, long before this night ever arrived, someone may have already known this could happen. So the question hangs in the dark, sharp and unanswered. When a system fails this badly, who decided it was acceptable to let it happen anyway? The order is given and the launch happens the way it always does, smooth enough to feel routine, until the routine fractures and time begins to stretch in unnatural ways, because the crew senses the mistake before they understand it. The silence after the launch does not feel empty. It feels crowded, heavy, as if something unseen is moving where it should not be. Men glance at one another, not speaking yet, waiting for confirmation that never comes, and then the realization hits, not as a shouted warning, but as a creeping dread that the danger has not gone away. It has changed direction. Inside the cramped steel hull, breaths grow shallow as the idea forms in their minds. The weapon is still active, still searching, and no longer pointed at the enemy. There is a moment when hope tries to survive, when someone convinces himself that this is just a delay, a strange pause before success, but that hope collapses as the movement becomes undeniable. The threat is circling. Not drifting, not stopping, circling. Orders come fast now, clipped and sharp, but they carry no certainty, only urgency, because every maneuver feels like guessing in the dark. The submarine turns, dives, adjusts course, and with every change comes the fear that the movement itself is being noticed, tracked, remembered. The crew realizes they are no longer hunters. They are targets locked inside their own weapon's reach. Faces tighten, knuckles whiten, and the quiet fills with unspoken calculations about distance, timing, and survival, none of them comforting. The mission they were sent to complete evaporates, replaced by a single brutal objective: escape what they have just unleashed. No one explains why this is happening, because there is no time for explanations, only reactions layered on top of panic that refuses to show itself openly. The submarine's interior, once familiar and controlled, now feels fragile, as if one wrong sound or motion could be enough to end everything. Every second stretches longer than the last as the crew waits for impact that may or may not come, knowing that if it does, it will come from their own decision, their own launch, their own trust. This is the instant when belief collapses, when the idea of reliability shatters, because accidents drift away, but this feels deliberate, persistent, almost aware. And as the submarine fights to outrun what should never have chased it, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This is not a random malfunction, not a momentary glitch, but a clear breaking point where confidence turns into liability and survival depends on luck rather than design. By the time the immediate danger begins to fade, if it fades at all, the damage is already done, because the crew now understands something they can never unlearn, that the system meant to protect them has the power to turn inward, and tonight it almost did. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just what went wrong, but what was supposed to happen instead, because everything about this system had been built around certainty, simplicity, and trust. The Navy did not treat this weapon as a gamble. It was presented as a solution, a reliable answer to an unforgiving environment where hesitation meant death and precision meant survival. Crews were trained to believe that once it left the tube, its purpose was singular and irreversible, that it would move outward, lock onto its intended path, and remove a threat without ever demanding attention again. It was meant to reduce chaos, not introduce it, to create distance between sailors and danger, not collapse that distance until fear could be felt in every breath. On paper and in practice, it represented control, the idea that human judgment could be safely handed off to a machine and trusted to behave as promised. That promise shaped decisions, strategies, and confidence at sea, turning launch moments into brief, almost routine transitions rather than points of terror. But the failure just witnessed shatters that expectation completely, because nothing about a weapon that turns back on its own crew fits the image that was sold, trained, and believed. The contrast is brutal. What was meant to be predictable becomes erratic. What was meant to simplify becomes something that demands constant attention, and what was meant to protect instead forces sailors to fight for their lives against their own equipment. This was not a case of pushing limits or experimenting at the edge of safety. It was a standard action performed with full confidence in the outcome. That confidence is what makes the moment feel like betrayal rather than bad luck, because the gap between expectation and reality is too wide to ignore. When a system fails in a way that directly contradicts its core promise, it leaves behind more than fear. It leaves doubt, the kind that spreads quietly and changes how every future decision is made. The crew does not need explanations yet to understand the weight of that doubt. The simple fact that this should not have failed like this is enough to make the night feel longer, heavier, and far more dangerous than it was meant to be. As the shock of that night begins to settle, an uncomfortable truth starts to surface, because this incident does not stand alone in isolation the way accidents usually do. Quietly, through stories shared in low voices and moments of recognition that pass between crews, it becomes clear that others have felt this same fear before. Other launches that did not end cleanly. Other missions where confidence dissolved into confusion. Different crews, different waters, but the same unsettling outcome, a system behaving in ways it was never supposed to. In more than one case, a weapon failed to move outward as expected, lingering instead, hesitating, or behaving as if it were unsure of its own purpose, forcing sailors to react rather than execute. The details vary, but the pattern does not, and that is what makes it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Each time, the response follows the same rhythm. Initial disbelief, followed by frantic adjustments, followed by silence when the danger finally passes. No public alarm is raised, no dramatic halt is ordered, and no sweeping change follows immediately. Instead, the incidents stack quietly on top of one another, connected by the same design, the same trust, and the same risks accepted again and again. What should have triggered urgent reconsideration instead becomes normalized through repetition, as if surviving the failure once makes it easier to accept the possibility of surviving it again. The weapon continues to be used, the launches continue, and the faith that underpins them grows thinner with every close call. This repetition transforms the problem from a single terrifying moment into something far more disturbing, a system that fails in familiar ways, producing familiar fear, while the machinery of routine keeps moving forward. At this point, the question shifts from how this happened to why it keeps being allowed to happen, because patterns are not accidents, and repetition is not chance. The danger lies not just in the failure itself, but in the decision to treat it as manageable, survivable, and therefore acceptable, even as the same shadow follows crew after crew into the dark. The pattern would have been easier to accept if no one had seen it coming, but beneath the surface of routine and confidence, doubts had already begun to form long before these nights at sea unfolded. Concerns surfaced quietly, passed along in careful language, shaped to avoid panic rather than provoke action, and they pointed to behaviors that did not match promises. Tests raised questions. Reports hinted at inconsistencies. Observations were noted, filed, and softened until they sounded less like warnings and more like minor imperfections that could be addressed later. Each signal on its own was easy to downplay, especially when the system still appeared to work often enough to maintain faith, but together they formed a picture that was hard to ignore for anyone willing to look closely. Yet looking closely carried its own risks, because acknowledging doubt meant slowing momentum, questioning decisions already made, and admitting that confidence had outpaced certainty. So the warnings were delayed, reframed, or absorbed into a culture that valued continuation over interruption. No single order demanded silence, and no single voice chose ignorance. Instead, hesitation spread responsibility thin enough that nothing had to stop. The weapon remained in use, the missions continued, and the uneasy knowledge lingered just out of sight, shared among those who suspected something was wrong but lacked the authority or urgency to force change. What makes this moment so unsettling is not the existence of doubt, but the way it was managed, contained, and ultimately outweighed by the desire to move forward. At some point, uncertainty stopped being a reason to pause and became something to live with, and that shift, from caution to acceptance, marks the line where ignorance ends and choice begins. Behind every report, every quiet warning, and every decision to continue, there were men sealed inside narrow hulls, carrying the weight of that choice without ever being part of it. For the crews, the danger was not abstract or theoretical. It was felt in the vibration of the steel around them, in the tension that followed every launch, and in the silence that stretched a little too long afterward. Each mission required them to trust a system that had already proven capable of turning inward, and that knowledge changed everything. Sleep came harder. Confidence thinned, and routine actions began to carry an edge of fear that could not be spoken aloud without breaking discipline. Some crews faced moments where survival depended on split-second decisions made in the shadow of their own equipment, knowing that one wrong move could turn a failure into a catastrophe. Others never had the chance to react, their missions ending abruptly, leaving behind unanswered questions and families who would never fully understand what went wrong. Even when disaster was narrowly avoided, the cost remained, etched into memory and carried forward into every subsequent patrol. The ocean did not care whether the danger came from an enemy or from within, and neither did the consequences. What binds these experiences together is not just loss, but the knowledge that the risk was not entirely unknown, that fear had been quietly accepted as part of the job rather than confronted as a flaw. These were not reckless men chasing danger. They were professionals doing what they were told, trusting that the system behind them was worthy of that trust. When that trust failed, it was their lives, their nerves, and their futures that absorbed the impact, turning institutional decisions into deeply personal consequences that could never be fully measured. When the immediate danger fades and the patrols continue, there is no moment of closure, no announcement that draws a clean line under what happened, only a lingering unease that settles into the culture and refuses to leave. The system remains in place, the launches still occur, and the silence around past failures grows heavier with time, not lighter. Questions circulate quietly among those who have felt the fear firsthand, questions that never quite reach the surface where answers might be demanded. Was this risk truly unavoidable, or simply tolerated? At what point does confidence become denial, and at what point does routine turn into complicity? The absence of clear resolution becomes its own kind of answer, suggesting that some failures are easier to live with than to confront openly. What makes this legacy so disturbing is not just that it happened, but that it was absorbed, normalized, and carried forward as if survival alone justified continuation. Somewhere between necessity and neglect, a line was crossed, and once crossed, it became harder to see it all. The ocean kept its secrets, the institution moved on, and the men who served were left with memories rather than explanations. If a weapon could fail this profoundly and still remain trusted, the question is no longer about a single night or a single system. It is about how many other moments like this were buried beneath routine, and how many more waited in the dark, unseen, accepted, and unspoken.